Okay, welcome to part 2 of our lecture on the First British Empire, and in this second part we will be shifting our attention a little bit away from trade and the mercantile system, and our focus will be more so on how the colonies were governed. And perhaps in this section you might pick up on some of the disadvantages that the British government faced because of the size and scale of the British Empire. There were challenges that would be thrown up, and the diversity of the First British Empire, the differences between, say, the Caribbean and the 13 colonies, and the 13 colonies and the kind of more northernly colonies in Canada. These kind of differences made it quite difficult to adopt a kind of single policy towards the colonies. When the British did, to some extent, adopt a more kind of punitive method of governing the colonies, then problems emerged. Okay, when we looked at the previous section and we spoke about the benefits that were received by all of these different segments of the British population, from manufacturers to merchants to consumers and so on and so forth. Our focus tended to be on the luxury goods, tobacco and sugar, that to some extent were the kind of cash crops that were the very essence of places like Virginia and the Caribbean islands. And these goods, undoubtedly were the most significant, especially sugar, most significant examples of commodities that produced lots of wealth in different parts of the British Empire. But obviously the main benefits were for those living in Britain. There were some other examples of the reciprocal relationship between Britain and the colonies that did not involve luxury items. And I'm not going to go through it in any detail, but So 6 gives you a kind of slightly different example of how somewhere like Glasgow, or Scotland in general, could benefit from the existence of colonies. And I'm not talking about tobacco in this instance, we're talking about slave cloth. Cheap linen cloth could be produced in Glasgow and sent to the Caribbean islands, where thousands upon thousands of slaves had to be clothed, and this was a good deal for the Scottish textile industry, but also a good deal for the plantation owners in the colonies, who benefited from having this relationship, this close relationship with the motherland. And in that instance, there is a clear reciprocal relationship, and therefore we have to remember that although the colonies did have this purpose, right, and this purpose was to serve the British motherland, we should always remember that there was some benefits to the 13 colonies in North America, or even to the Caribbean. And that is because, although the Navigation Acts did limit and restrict the trading opportunities of the merchants in the colonies, they also did provide some advantages, and that would be guaranteed markets. So, in some respects, Virginians might like the idea of selling their produce directly to France or the Netherlands, rather than having to go through this British middleman, as the Navigation Acts, part of the mercantilist system, demanded. But on the other hand, they had the security and protection of the British Army, more so the British Navy, and they were guaranteed a price for their produce. Maybe they could have made more money if it had went to France or the Netherlands, but these were not captive markets. At least Britain was a captive market. So the North American colonies, more so than maybe the Caribbean, there are differences in these two types of colonies that I'm going to explain in a moment, but the North American colonies could benefit to some extent from the Navigation Acts that emerged over the course of the 17th and 18th century. And this special relationship that Britain has with the 13 colonies, as illustrated in this diagram, means that yes, Britain to some extent did keep other European powers away from the North American colonies. It was difficult for other European countries to have access to tobacco because Britain ensured that she would control what was going on within the 13 colonies. It was difficult for other European countries to access the indigo or the rice markets that the colonies in North America also provided. So Britain, yes, is the main benefactor of this relationship, but the special relationship did still help the colonies. We should always bear that in mind. Ireland, I guess, was part of the British Empire at this point. Now, the Irish might have argued that they did not benefit from their place within the British Empire. This is a story that we will come back to later on when we study the Irish famine of the 1840s. But for a long time, the Irish felt that they had been subjected to unfair British policies where the best land in Ireland had been swallowed up by the British aristocracy. So the special relationship didn't always go down too well on the Emerald Isle. In Jamaica, the largest sugar island, there was evidence that the black population clearly did not benefit from being part of this special relationship with Britain. I don't know if you can recall question 12 and question 13 of the Empire video clip that you just watched with Neil Ferguson. There was a discussion towards the end of the video about the Maroons, and the Maroons were runaway slaves in the island of Jamaica who detested slavery so much and felt slavery to be so repressive and violent that they escaped. They were runaway slaves, and they set up their own communities in the island, the mountains of Jamaica, and they're a thorn in the side of the British throughout the period. I'm going to come to some throughout the period of the 18th century. I'm going to come to some of the examples of the Maroons in a second. Also, sources 4, 5 and 7 in your Word document that's on My City refer to Mary Prince, who writes a testimony or a narrative of her time as a slave. She was a slave in Barbados, but eventually manages to escape and makes her way to Britain. You can get a real sense that someone like Mary Prince does not think there's any benefit to being a slave in Barbados. There's no advantages here for former Africans who are subjected to, in the case of Mary Prince, domestic labour, where she is treated rather appallingly by her different masters, and you can read about this in your own time. So when we start to look at how the colonies are governed, whether it be Ireland or whether it be Jamaica, again we'll get to the United States, or what would become the United States in a moment. The British, have a good record when it comes to trade, but not so good a record when it comes to how they treat their colonies during this period of the First British Empire. And as I said, we'll come to America in a moment. On the next 4 kind of slides, I've kind of taken little sections from the historian James Walvin's book on slavery in the New World, and there's some really good little sections here on the Maroon population in Jamaica. In particular, just this kind of first little section where Walvin says, from the early days of British settlement after 1655, Jamaica had proved a difficult island to master, right? So governing Jamaica was more problematic than the British had hoped for. The land, which yielded such a bounty in sugar and rum, was also ideally suited for rebellious slaves. In the mountains and in the densely forested cockpits, where good agricultural land runs into almost impenetrable country, there was room and opportunity for escape. Right, so obviously slaves detested their experiences so much that any chance to flee from their slave owner and their plantation, they took it. It was here in this impenetrable country that the famous Maroon communities developed. These were blacks living in freedom beyond plantocratic reach, so beyond the plantations, in their own settlements, fiercely independent and resistant to any suggestions of British control. So the Maroons are a good example of a problem that the British had to deal with, right? The British have to address this problem. Why were the Maroons a problem? because they were a symbol that other slaves, if they found out about them, could aspire to. The idea of running away, but not just running away without any place to go, but here was somewhere you could run away to and be part of a black community. So that is a problem for the British. As Neil Ferguson referred to in the video clip, what the British did, and you can read this in the remainder of this section, what the British did was they find a way to negotiate with the Maroons, and they accept, rather than trying to suppress them or fight them eventually, they give up and negotiate. And what the negotiations really involve is that the Maroons will help quell any future slave revolts on plantations. And with this kind of guarantee, the British kind of allow the Maroons to live their lives in other parts of Jamaica. So governing African slaves wasn't always easy, and as I mentioned in the previous section, the previous lecture, there was always this fear that slaves might try and escape. There was always this fear that maybe there would be some type of violence and rage unleashed upon plantation owners, and this was a kind of tense atmosphere that wealthy plantation owners in the Caribbean rightly had to accept. So there is definitely a challenge that the British faces when it comes to governing the Sugar Islands, and these 4 pages from the Walvin source are really useful when it comes to your assessment. Okay, I'm going to now go this way. When I say assessment, only if you decide to do this question on the First British Empire. Okay, we are now moving on to the second significant section of the First British Empire, and that is the 13 American colonies. And in this slide, I'm just very briefly going to talk about the relationship between Britain and the North American colonies, and what basically happens that will lead to the American desire for independence. Now, the American colonies were rather different to the Sugar Islands of Barbados and Jamaica. Most people who went to Jamaica or Barbados, so white British migrants, they go there to make their fortune, right? They go there to make money. They are not necessarily of the opinion that they're going to stay there too long. Some of them obviously do stay for a long time, live their entire life there because they like the lifestyle, but many go there with the intention of making money before coming back to Britain and not having to concern themselves with working again because they've made so much in their time in the colonies. Those who made their way to the 13 colonies had a very different outlook. They were going there with the intention of never returning to Britain more often than not. So people weren't going to the colonies to make a fortune, right? They're not going there purely to make large amounts of money. They're going there for religious reasons. They're going there for reasons of opportunity. They're maybe fleeing Britain due to economic recession. They are maybe going to Britain because there are opportunities to own farms. That is a very different reason than for people going to Barbados and Jamaica. Remember that a large segment of the populations in Jamaica and Barbados are African, right? Now there are slaves in the 13 colonies, right? Roughly 20% at the time of independence are African descent. But 80%, the vast majority of those living in America, are white, and more often than not Protestant, and more often than not educated, and more often than not in favour of some form of democratic system. Therefore, how Britain governs people who see themselves as British and who see themselves as having the same rights as the British is very different to what was going on in Jamaica, right? The British could wage war against the Maroons, they could threaten the Maroons, they could enforce kind of negotiations upon the Maroons, the plantation owners, with the backing of the British military, could really treat slaves however they pleased. That's not the case in the 13 colonies, because the 13 colonies regard themselves as white British Protestants. Now, for most of the 18th century, at least for the first half of it, and if you go further back into the 17th century, the relationship between the colonies and Britain is pretty good, because most of the colonies, as I say, are British. Okay, there's some Dutch and there's some Germans and French and Spaniards, but on the whole, the colonists see themselves as being British. And because the British had adopted a method of governance that was referred to by Benjamin Franklin as benign neglect, there was really very little to cause any disruption between the colonies and the motherland. What we really mean by benign neglect is that the colonies were kind of left to their own devices, where they kind of governed themselves. Each of the 13 colonies had their own legislator. They governed themselves, they taxed themselves. They were quite happy to be part of the British Empire. They were happy to have the kind of protection, if you like, of the British Army and the British Navy from Native American attacks or from French or potentially Spanish attacks. But they also kind of liked being left alone. Now, this relationship of benign neglect changes after the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War is a war between Britain and France, sometimes known as the French Indian War. It was a global conflict. Much of it takes place in North America. At the end of this war, Britain takes territory from the French, and Britain expands the amount of land that it owns in North America, right? Both Canada and present-day United States. What happens after the 7 Years' War is Britain is in serious debt. The 7 Years' War, just bankrupts the British, and the taxpayer back in Britain really has to again bear the brunt of this conflict. The British, by 1763, when the war ends, start to think that maybe the colonies should start to pay their way. If they want to be part of the British Empire, if they see themselves as being British, well, they should really have to contribute their fair share of the cost of empire. What the British do is they start to impose laws and legislation. This little image here represents the Stamp Act of 1765, which was a tax basically placed on newspapers and legal documents, and this little penny tax would help pay for the cost of upkeeping British officials and British administrators and British tax collectors and so on in the colonies. It would be, to some extent, in the eyes of the British Parliament, a way where the colonies could pay and say thanks for having the British Army and the British government protecting and supporting them. Prior to the Stamp Act in 1764, there had been a Sugar Act, which had the same purpose. When the Stamp Act is passed, the colonies are not happy. In fact, they're angry, and there is great violence that follows the passage of the Stamp Act. Now, you might think, why would the colonies be so irrational, so aggressive in their approach to a piece of legislation which might seem fair? Well, the problem was not so much the cost, not so much the financial burden of the stamp tax, but it was the principle that was really at odds with what the Americans believed to be their freedoms and liberties. Colonial legislators, so that would be the Virginia legislator, the House of Burgess, or the Massachusetts legislator, or the New York legislator, whatever one, they made decisions for themselves, they governed themselves, and they taxed themselves, right? The view was, and this became the motto of the early advocates of kind of revolutionary activity in the colonies that would eventually lead to independence. The motto was no taxation without representation, meaning that the colonies were not represented in the British Parliament. They did not send MPs to the British Parliament, and they couldn't because of the practical issues of thousands of miles over the Atlantic. But because they weren't represented, their view was, you can't tax us, The only people who paid taxes or are treated in such a way would be women or children or slaves. They're not represented. Do Americans want to be kind of thrown into the same category? And the answer is obviously no, because they regard themselves as being free Brits who were, as I said, Protestant and educated. And therefore, in sources 2 and 3, especially source 2, you can get a sense from Benjamin Franklin that the British are really acting in a rational, unwise manner, and Franklin tells them this in Parliament, why they should get rid of the Stamp Act. And source 3 refers to the Declaratory Act, which after the Stamp Act was repealed in 1766, the British say, well, okay, we will repeal the Stamp Act, maybe that was not the best way to get you to pay your share, but we want to make clear that Parliament and the King are very much in charge of the colonies, and what we say shall go. That attitude from really 1765 onwards does not help relations in the colonies between Britain and the 13 colonies. And things get worse. The Stamp Act is followed by the Townshend Acts. These are more examples of taxation placed on goods like glass and lead and tea. And the Townshend Act had the one intention of raising our revenue to help pay for more British officials to be in the colonies to help maintain this larger expanded empire. The colonists again are disgusted by this legislation because they think that the powers of their own legislature are being diminished and more British officials are making their way to the colonies. What does that really mean for independent kind of democracy within each colony? Are colonies starting to lose some of their democratic rights? The Townshend Acts are so appalling to the colonists that they start to boycott British goods. So again, we just see another escalation in the tensions between the motherland and the colonies. Even though the colonies are not united in any way, they're only now united by this kind of anti-British sentiment. In 1768, British troops arrive in Boston. Why did they arrive in Boston? Because there was a real sense that the merchants and traders within Massachusetts, but in Boston in particular, were smuggling in goods illegally into the colony and not paying the taxation that they should have done so. One very famous incident occurs with a wealthy merchant called John Hancock, who's incidentally the first person to sign the American Declaration of Independence. And what happens is violence breaks out in 1768 when John Hancock is arrested, and the British decided to send troops into Boston to ensure that there would be no further unrest. Once these troops are in Boston, tensions increase again. There's a standing occupying force now in Boston, and this leads to scuffles in March of 1770, and then leads to British troops shooting on a crowd of protesters, which is known as the Boston Massacre. The propaganda that is then used by the colonists who favour independence as a result of this massacre is so important because it helps link all of the 13 colonies together, because they now have an example of British tyranny in action. And the Boston Massacre will be a real kind of milestone en route to American independence, as is probably the most famous of events of all, which is the Boston Tea Party. Again, the British try to impose a tax on the colonies, and this tax is on tea. When they do so, most of the colonies refuse to accept the tea, but tea does make its way to Boston Harbour, and the colonists, led by Sam Adams, one of the early revolutionaries in the colonies, they march to Boston Harbour and take the tea off the ship and dump it into the Charles River in Boston. So the Boston Tea Party isn't really much other than throwing tea into the river. But the British believed that this property had to be paid for, so they punished Boston, and when they punished Boston, eventually scuffles turns into full-on conflict. The colonies decide to get together and they set up the first Continental Congress, followed by the Second Continental Congress, where they appoint George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of this new American Continental Army. Eventually, it gets to a point where the colonists think there is no way back in their relationship with the British, and in 1776 they declare their independence, and full-on war carries on until 1883, when the British accept that they can't win this war, they have to give up, and America becomes independent. So governing the colonies is a real challenge from a distance, and British arrogance and obnoxious British politicians and I guess maybe slightly anti-democratic British politicians treat the colonies as if they are children, and don't want to see them flourish, and don't want to see them make make their own kind of decisions, if you like. This is why the historian Simon Sharma uses this term, wrong empire. The empire was meant to be this free Protestant empire in North America. You know, the Massachusetts colony was one of the most educated of all. You have Harvard University set up here in the 17th century. You've got men who are incredibly intelligent. You've got inventors, you've got writers, philosophers. This was meant to be the British Empire, but because Britain itself was not overly keen on this version of the empire having too much freedom, then both sides come to blows. And it's because the colonies believed that they had the right to govern themselves, and the British believed that they did not have the right to govern themselves. If there had been a return to this policy of benign neglect after the 7 Years' War, who knows what would have happened in terms of the relationship between Britain and what is now America. So there are real challenges in governing the empires. It's not all economic advantages. Governing colonies can lead to rebellions, as we see in Jamaica, and it can lead to revolution, as we see in the 13 colonies. Now, there will be a very short tutorial in a couple of lessons time, which will focus on all the material that we've covered for the First British Empire, and more important than anything, we will talk about the essay question for this topic. Thank you.